everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I'm an immigration attorney with Scott Legal PC in New York City. Today, we're going to spend some time talking about the TN visa. Now, the TN is one of the most common visas that our office assists our clients with. And there's a good reason for this. If you are a national of Canada or Mexico, there really are fewer options to live and work in the United States that are more straightforward and faster than the TN option. It really is a great visa for nationals of Canada or Mexico. We're going to be talking about the TN visa requirements and also talking about a very common question that our office gets, which is whether the TN visa actually requires sponsorship by the employer. A few things before we get started. Some of you may already know that our firm's founder, Ian Scott, was on a TN visa for a decade. He went through a number of renewals, and so his experience navigating the process really does inform the way that we work with our clients. We really are able to understand where they are and how they feel in the process, and we're happy to incorporate that experience into how we work with our clients. Our firm is a full-service immigration firm. So though we do focus on business immigration, we do handle all aspects of immigration, including family immigration and humanitarian immigration. So if you have any questions involving U.S. immigration, we do encourage you to reach out to our firm. This webinar is part of an ongoing series. We try to do at least 2 webinars a month, and oftentimes we do many more than that. So after this presentation, we'll send you a link where you can sign up for our future webinars, and we do hope to see you on those as well. Also, the email that we send you after this presentation will have a link to the PowerPoint that you see on your screen, as well as a comprehensive guide to the TN visa. We'll also send you a link to this recording. The webinar is being recorded. And finally, a link to our YouTube channel. So on our YouTube channel, we post our webinars as well as shorter videos. And these are on a variety of topics involving U.S. immigration. So we do hope that you find those helpful. If you have a question, please do send it in through either the Q&A function or the chat function on Zoom. And also, if there are any issues with my video being choppy or freezing, please do send me a note through either the chat or the Q&A function. That would be helpful to know. I think our office's internet has been having some issues recently, but hopefully they won't affect this presentation. We are very fortunate to have with us today Kelly LeGrand Weiner, who is our firm's managing attorney. And Kelly has extensive experience helping clients navigate the TN visa application process, as well as a variety of other immigration options, including business immigration, family immigration. She is going to handle the second half of this presentation, where we talk about some of the more complicated areas of the TN visa. So you'll be seeing her momentarily. All right, well, with that, let's go ahead and dive in, and we will talk about the TN visa requirements. So to qualify for a TN visa, you must be a national of Canada or Mexico. The TN visa is rooted in NAFTA, which is a treaty between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So you do need to be a citizen of Canada or Mexico to apply. Now, you must be applying to come to the United States to work in a specific profession that is listed in the NAFTA regulations. So if you are at your computer right now, I would recommend that you go onto Google and quickly search for NAFTA TN regulations, because I will be referring to these regulations throughout the presentation. And what you'll see when you click on the link to the regulations, 8 CFR 214.6, you scroll down a bit and you start seeing a list of jobs. You see accountant, architect, computer systems analyst, etc., etc. And next to each, so if we start with accountant, you'll see the qualifications. So to come to the US as an accountant on a TN visa, you need to have a baccalaureate degree or a licenciatura degree, or one of these professional licenses. So these are the qualifications to come to the US as an accountant in TN status. So we'll be referring to these regulations throughout the presentation. So if you are at your computer, it's helpful to just have them up on your browser. So one of the fundamental requirements for a TN visa is you do need to be coming to the US to work in one of these listed professions. Though there are dozens of listed professions, some are just not listed. So you see there's really no role for someone who's coming to the US to work, for example, as in marketing necessarily. So there are a number of roles that are not listed. And unfortunately for many people, that is the end of the road. However, as Kelly will be talking about a little bit later, especially when she talks about the management consultant category, there are ways to thoughtfully and creatively frame an application to include someone who's doing a job that doesn't seem to clearly fit into one of the listed professions, to maybe fit them under another profession that might be a better fit. And I'll just quickly add here, when we refer to professions, what matters is not the job title. What matters is the job duties. And we'll talk about how to figure out what the government counts as job duties. Specifically, again, I'll give you another link. The Occupational Outlook Handbook, which is published by the US Department of Labor, if you want to quickly Google OOH, and let's take as an example accountant, since it's the first on our list. If you Google OOH accountant and click that link, you'll see at the top of the page that there is a link to what they do. It's one of the tabs at the top of the page. And if you click that, you'll scroll down and see duties. So these are the job duties that the US government thinks that an accountant does. So the reason I'm sharing this is when you are trying to figure out if your profession falls within a TN professional category, you want to think about your job duties. What will the job duties you'll be doing in the US be? And then you want to search the Occupational Outlook Handbook to make sure that those job duties fall within the title that is in the TN regulations. So if you are applying to come to the US as an accountant, for example, you want to search OOH accountant and just make sure your job duties in the US are aligned with those. Because when you're applying for a TN visa, those are the job duties that the border official or the consular officer will be looking at to figure out if you're actually going to be doing the job you say you are. So let's keep going down this list you see on your screen. You must have the required qualifications to practice the profession. So as I mentioned before, these are specifically listed in the regulations. Again, for an accountant, for example, it's a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree, or one of the listed professional licenses. If you don't have either of those, then you unfortunately don't qualify to be an accountant on a TN visa. Now, one thing to notice is that the qualifications do change depending on your profession. As I mentioned, Kelly will talk about the management consultant category a little later, but if you look at that category, it's very unique because to qualify as a management consultant, you can have a baccalaureate degree or professional experience. So you don't actually need a degree to apply to be a management consultant in the TN on a TN visa. The management consultant is really one of, I believe, two categories that doesn't require a degree. So that's part of the reason why it's a special category. Some professions, you do need a degree. So if you look at social worker, you do need a degree to qualify. You cannot qualify based on a professional license or experience. So those qualifications are fortunately very clearly laid out in the regulations, but unfortunately, they really are rigid requirements. If you don't have the qualifications, you just don't qualify. And also keep in mind when it says or. So for accountant, it says a degree or the professional license. So if you have the professional license, you don't need the degree as well. If you have the degree, you don't necessarily need the license. So keep that in mind as well. You must also have a pre-arranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the United States. So when you're applying for the TN visa, you actually do need a job offer in hand. You cannot be applying for a TN visa to come to the US and look for the job. You actually need to have been in touch with the employer. They need to have expressed that they're willing to hire you. they need to actually provide you with a letter that explains what role you will have once you're given the visa, what your job duties will be, how long they intend to employ you. Typically, that's for 3 years or less. And also what they intend to pay you. So that really does need to already be arranged with the employer. And you'll give that letter to either the consular officer or the border officer when you apply for the visa. And finally, in that job, you need to actually be employed to engage in the professional activities that are consistent with the profession. So for example, if you're applying to come to the US as an accountant, but once you enter, you plan to engage in marketing activities, working on their social media campaign, for example, that's not going to be approved. That's not going to be permissible because you actually need to be coming to the US to work as an accountant, for example, or to work in the profession that you've been approved for. And again, to figure out what job duties those are, you need to go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook and do a search there on your profession to see what the job duties are that the government thinks that profession does. Let's quickly talk about one of the most common questions that we hear, which is, does a TN visa require sponsorship by the employer? So if you remember, you already need to have a job offer in hand from a US employer before you apply for the TN visa. Now, many employers are understandably concerned that if they agree to give a TN prospect a job offer, that they will be responsible for testing the US labor market, making sure there's no US citizen worker who's available for the job before they hire the TN worker, making sure they're paying a prevailing wage, which is higher than minimum wage. All of these requirements are not required for a TN. So many employers have in mind visas like the H-1B, visas like even a green card, where they actually do sponsor someone for a green card. The H-1B, the green card options are much more burdensome for an employer than a TN. And those options, H-1B, green card, do require what we would call sponsorship. We would say that a TN actually does not require sponsorship as it's understood to mean in the context of US immigration. And the reason is the only thing that an employer, the US employer, needs to do for a TN visa is to provide a legitimate job offer to the applicant and to provide a letter. And that letter needs to, as I mentioned before, really explain the terms of employment, the pay, how long they intend to pay the worker. But this letter is not really a contract. It really is expressing the employer's intention. The employer is able to fire the worker. If it turns out that they come to the US and it's just not working out, they're not obligated to keep employing the worker. And on the other hand, the worker, the employee, is not required to keep working for the employer. They are at will. So they can quit, they can try to seek employment elsewhere. Obviously they would need to comply with immigration laws if they follow that path. But the point is, if we're looking at the requirements on the TN employer, they really are minimal, and they are not what is typically thought of within the context of sponsorship. So you see on your screen a few examples. The TN only requires the employer filing forms with USCIS if the employee is already inside the US and applying through USCIS. If the employee is outside the US, they must apply either at a border or at a consulate. And in that case, the employer is not going to be filing any forms. The only thing they are providing is that letter that I mentioned before. TNs are also not location specific. So it is okay if the employer has a couple offices. Oftentimes remote work is okay on a TN. There's also no prevailing wage requirement. So the employer, of course, as any employer in the United States, has to comply with minimum wage laws, assuming they have enough employees to meet that requirement. But they don't have to pay a higher wage if it's not required by federal or local law or state law. So they would treat the TN worker, in other words, as they would any other employee when it comes to pay. There is no higher wage that's required by immigration law. I referenced this before, but the applicant, the employee, can apply for a TN at either a port of entry if they are Canadian, or at a consulate. And Canadians do have the option to apply at a consulate. Mexican nationals must apply at a consulate if they're outside the US. We'll talk more about the details with both of those processes. And if the applicant, whether Canadian or Mexican, is inside the United States, they can apply to change their status to TN status through USCIS without leaving the United States. They can stay here and apply for that from within the US. So let's talk in more detail about the differences of applying for a TN if you're a national of Canada versus Mexico. Canadians really do have the option of an easier application process, and that's because they can apply for a TN visa at a port of entry, and that means either a land crossing or at an airport. That is enormously convenient because it means they have an immediate decision. They can literally go to a land crossing with their employer letter, with proof that they qualify for the TN, and they can find out in a matter of often minutes whether they are going to be admitted into the US in TN status. And once they're admitted in TN status, they're able to start working for the employer. So this really is a hugely convenient option for nationals of Canada. When they are admitted into the US, their visa is issued for 3 years. So they have essentially TN status for 3 years. If they have a spouse who is a national of Canada, then that spouse can also apply at the port of entry with them. However, if the spouse is not a national of Canada, they can qualify for dependent status. It's called TD status, but they must go to a consulate to apply for it. They cannot apply at a port of entry. Ports of entry only have authority to grant a TN visa to nationals of Canada. Now, that's for Canadians. Canadians also have the option, if you're a national of Canada, you can apply at a consulate. Unless your spouse is not a national of Canada, there's usually no good reason for them to apply at a consulate. It's much easier and faster to apply at a port of entry. Nationals of Mexico, on the other hand, do not have the option to apply at a port of entry. Nationals of Mexico must apply for a TN visa at a consulate. So to do this, they would file the online DS-160, and then they would be scheduled for their biometrics, their fingerprints, and for an interview. And they would go to their interview and they'd bring with them the same materials that a Canadian national would bring to the border, which would be the letter from the employer, an original signed letter on the company's letterhead explaining the terms of employment. They'd bring original proof that they qualify, so that would be a diploma, possibly a transcript, or if it's based on experience, original signed letters from past employers talking about their experience. They would bring that packet, which again would be the same that a national of Canada would bring to the border, but a national of Mexico would bring it to the consulate, to their interview. And there they would be, if they're approved, granted the visa in their passport. Once they have the visa, they would be able to travel into the US. Now, one of the benefits for nationals of Mexico is that they were recently the consulate was given authority to issue visas, TN visas, for 4-year periods. So in the past, it was significantly shorter. So we do generally recommend that applicants pay the additional fee to get the 4-year visa so that they don't have to reapply sooner. Now, when they enter the US, they would typically be granted status for a 3-year period, as well as Canadians would. Now, when a national of Mexico is applying to renew their TN visa, there is the option for the consulate to permit the renewal through mail, where they don't have to go in person. But that is up to the consulate, and you would need to apply and then wait for the consulate to let you know whether your interview has been waived. But that is something that does happen with some frequency. So at this point, I will go ahead and pass it off to my colleague Kelly to talk about difficult TN categories.
Thank you, Dustin. Perfect. So we're going to talk about two categories today that are used relatively frequently, but are also scrutinized more heavily than other categories. So, the first one we have here is the management consultant. And the reason why this one is often, scrutinized more heavily is that it doesn't require a degree. You can qualify solely with experience. And so what that means is that it's often been tried, people will try to use it almost as a catch-all for any type of job that doesn't really neatly fit into one of the other categories on the list. Because you can qualify with either a degree or 5 years of experience as a management consultant, or 5 years of experience in a field especially related to a consulting agreement. So where you're doing management consulting work in a particular field in which you have expertise, you can also qualify. So, this is why, people will often try to fit jobs into this category. Sometimes that can be done quite successfully. And sometimes, there's not enough of a nexus, with really what management consulting is in order to qualify. So, one thing to consider is that, for this category, the person is not meant to be coming to fulfill a permanent role or, even a normal role within the hierarchy of the company. So if we think about, for example, an engineering, TN, where a company needs to hire an engineer for a regular position within their organization. They issue the letter, the person can get the TN. For a management consultant, they asking for 3 years, that may not be, necessarily a good strategy, because what if, usually the company is going to bring on a management consultant for a particular period of time. That consultant will then, analyze data, look into the operations, and then provide recommendations to management. And so usually, those types of, arrangements are not necessarily going to last for 3 years. They may even last for more than 3 years. But it's something where you need to be more prepared to kind of make that argument as to what is the scope of the work that you're doing, so that they feel comfortable that the company is not just using this category as a workaround, to hire you on the TN. But it can be a very helpful category, and it is important to recognize that you don't necessarily need to have that bachelor's in business administration or 5 years of management consulting experience if you are coming in to truly do management consulting type work in a field in which you have 5 years of experience. You could be brought on, for example, let's say you have a background in marketing. And you're going to be brought on to, evaluate the marketing team operations, see what, what areas need to be improved, what needs to happen with staffing. If you can show that you have 5 years of experience in this area of marketing, and that there's a consulting agreement there, that could be utilized, appropriately for management consulting. So this is one, way that you can use this, this category for kind of roles that are a little bit, outside the, narrow scope of the professions on the list. Another category that used to be much broader and has been narrowed in recent years is economist. So previously, this category was used for regularly and successfully for both financial analysts and market research analysts and market specialists. There was a new policy memo, not that new anymore, from November 2017, that really narrowed the scope significantly. And it explicitly said, financial analysts and market research analysts no longer qualify, under the economist category for TN. So there was a lot of market research specialists that needed to kind of reevaluate, what potential visas they could get because they were no longer qualified for TNs. So now the category is much more focused on, are you doing micro or macroeconomics? Are you doing economic analysis? People who are financial, there's kind of a very clear differentiation between, people doing that type of economists work and market research analysts, but for financial analysts, the line can be very tricky, to determine. So it is something where it's good to, talk with your employer, talk with your attorney, see what can be done in terms of the job description, and whether or not there is an ability or any flexibility in the job, but to potentially focus more on economic analysis. But I think that the line between what a financial analyst is doing and what an economist is doing can be kind of hard to draw. So it's important to kind of look back at how the government's going to interpret that to figure out, does this job actually meet the definition of economist? Because it used to be that any financial analyst job would qualify, and that's unfortunately no longer the case. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the TN application process. Dustin went over some of this earlier. So, for, Canadians generally very often going to be applying at a port of entry. You bring the job offer letter and supporting documentation showing your citizenship, so your passport, as well as your educational and professional qualifications. So always a good idea to bring, original diplomas, certified transcripts, original of your job offer letter. Some ports of entry are optimized for faster TN processing. So this is something where Customs and Border Protection will recommend that if it's your first time, that you may want to apply at one of these designated ports of entry. However, that's not required. You can apply at other places, but you may have a smoother experience, potentially going to one of the optimized, designated ports where they have, a system for processing these types of cases. If you are, a Mexican national, then you will need to go to a consulate to get your TN visa. So you would file a form DS-160 online. You'll pay a visa application fee. You'll schedule a biometrics appointment and a consular appointment, and you will attend an interview with a consular officer where they'll look at all the documentation you have and make a final decision on your application. If you're renewing, so you've gotten a TN visa before, you may be eligible to apply by mail. And then also you can potentially apply from within the United States. And this option is open to either Mexican or Canadian nationals. And that's where you're submitting an application to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Slightly different. The employer has to do a little bit more. So the employer themselves have to kind of sign and file form I-129, showing the parameters of the job that they're hiring you for. And there's a $460 filing fee. As well, if you want an answer quickly, within 15 calendar days, there's a premium processing fee that you can pay to the government to get that answer. So, that's also a potential option. Sometimes people, if they are already in the United States, they don't want to leave, or particularly during COVID, or when there's concerns about getting, appointments at the consulate for Mexican nationals, they may take this option, to file with USCIS. All right, and let's talk about some, common, TN pitfalls as well as tips. So one good tip is to call ahead to the port of entry if you haven't gone there or you're unfamiliar with their procedures. Generally you can call and there will be an officer who can answer questions that you have about when to come, how early to come. If you are going to a port of entry at an airport and you need to catch a flight, you want to make sure you're giving yourself significant amount of time, so that they have time to process you and you have time to make your flight. Also sometimes, there aren't as many officers during the weekend or maybe less experienced officers at various times. So, just good to call ahead to know that there's going to be capacity for you, when you come to the border. When you have the employer sign the letter, you want to make sure that the person who signs is very familiar with your case, is familiar with your job. And in case the border officer calls them, they should be available, to answer the phone and confirm any information that's in the application. So you always want to, especially if you're going to cross on a weekend or something like that, you want to just make sure that your prospective employer is aware that you're going to cross the border, you're going to your interview, and that they may be contacted during that day. So as I previously mentioned, you definitely want to bring originals where you can, official or certified transcripts, the original signed version of the employer letter. Some ports of entry are very picky about this, very picky about having the actual original signature on the letter. So you don't want some, it may be that can be easily solved, but to avoid that administrative hiccup of having to withdraw the case and come back later, always good to have the original with you. And then finally, the TN visa. This is a non-immigrant visa, and it does require, a showing of non-immigrant intent, specifically that you have a foreign residence that you don't intend to abandon, and that you maintain ties to your home country. So you do want to, particularly if this is your first TN, it may not be, that big a part of the application, assuming there are no kind of other red flags like immigrant petitions that were filed for you, or having, lots of immediate family members who are U.S. citizens. But in any event, you want to be prepared to discuss your future plans, be prepared to assure the officer that, you have temporary intent, that you maintain ties to your home country, that you intend to return there. And particularly as you get, as you've had more TN visas, so let's say you're renewing 2, 3, 4, 5 times, particularly if it's with the same employer, you can expect that you're going to start to get more questions, because if the visa can be granted for 3 years each time, and suddenly you've been in the United States for 12 years, they may start to really question, do you intend to go back? What are your plans? It can sometimes be a bit easier to answer this if you've kind of jumped around to different employers. But in any event, you always want to be prepared to explain this. And, some people find that over time, if they are kind of settling into their lives in the US, it may be better to try to switch to something like an L visa if they're eligible, or an H-1B visa, something that it does allow for dual intent. So you're not having the same concern, if ultimately you decide you want to stay in the United States permanently.
Perfect. Thank you, Kelly. So that actually concludes our presentation. We did just get a question, and I encourage others who have questions to please send them in. I am a Mexican citizen applying for a TN. I'm a psychologist applying for case manager in Chicago. I entered the US with a B2 visa as a minor, lived in the US 14 years, left as a minor. I've been living in Mexico for 15 years. Should I bring this up? So this is a little bit outside the scope of this presentation, because we're getting into potential questions of whether there was an overstay, how to approach that in the interview. So I would say, unless Kelly, you had something else to add here. Obviously, you are flagging, what may be a concern. If you've overstayed in the United States, that is certainly going to be a potential issue when you're applying for the visa. And there are ways to navigate that very carefully. It probably is a situation where you want to talk with an attorney. So I would recommend, if you do want to continue speaking with us about it, go ahead and schedule a consultation on our website. Kelly, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add there.
Yeah, no, I would echo that advice, that that really is a very, I'd say, complex situation. Like, overstays of that length definitely can complicate cases very significantly. So much better to kind of speak with an attorney and have a strategy in place before you go to your interview, just to make sure that you're describing it in the proper way, both in your DS-160 and at the interview.
Perfect. And then we got another question. This person got a job offer in Dallas, Fort Worth, and will be applying for the TN visa. Their employer is unfamiliar with the process and would like to learn if a firm we could help with a letter or advice to help them understand the process and their requirements. So the answer is absolutely. When someone hires us, some clients prefer that we interface directly with the employer and actually work with the employer to discuss the job duties, to discuss the Occupational Outlook Handbook, the TN regulations, and we work very closely with both the employee and the employer. Other clients prefer that the client, work with their employer, and then we will work with the prospective employee. Whatever the client prefers is absolutely fine. Now, on the question of sponsorship, part of the reason why we created this presentation is because it's not an unusual concern for employers to be worried about their obligations, thinking that they need to sponsor the employee. So we are very happy to have that conversation with the employer. Again, some clients prefer that we actually put something in writing as a legal memo. Some clients want us to hop on the phone with their employer and have a conversation. Whatever it is, we can work with you as the client to figure that out and really to clarify the process with the employer. Kelly, was there anything else you wanted to add before we move to the next one?
No, I think that covered it.
Perfect. So my spouse is in IT. If she gets a job on a TN visa, can I study? Okay, excellent question. We did not talk much about dependents. So if you are married and you receive a TN visa, your spouse and your children are generally eligible for a dependent visa, a TN dependent visa, which is called TD status. And what that gives them is the opportunity to live and to study in the United States. Unfortunately, a TD visa does not give the spouse or the child the option to work in the US. In order to work, they would independently need to apply for a TN visa or for any other visa that they might be eligible for to give them work authorization. But the TD visa for dependent spouses and dependent children is quite straightforward. If you can prove that the principal, the spouse or the parent, uh, is eligible for a TN, then they can come to the US and study here. All right, that concludes our questions. Great questions. Thank you to Kelly for sharing your expertise. Thank you to the audience for the great questions and for joining us today. Please do keep an eye out for the email we'll send momentarily. We do hope to see you on future webinars, and please reach out to us if we can be of any help in the meantime. Okay, have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.